Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Passing by Nella Larsen, originally published in 1929. This edition was published in 2021 with an introduction by Britt Bennett. It's 149 pages. Nella Larsen was a writer associated with the Harlem Renaissance period in the 1920s, but she's not a figure that fits with most Harlem Renaissance writers. She was kind of an outsider, really, in many different ways in her whole life. Um, she was born in 1891. Her mother was in Chicago. Her mother was a Danish immigrant, and her father was a mixed race man from the Danish West Indies. So she grew up in a mixed race family. She spent 2 or 3 years living in Denmark before they came back to Chicago. Eventually, her father abandoned the family, and her mother divorced him and married another Danish immigrant. And then she had another daughter by her second husband. So Nella became kind of an outsider in her own family, the only black member of her family after her father left. Um, Nella's mother wanted her to get an education. So she sent her to Fisk University, the historically black college in Nashville. But Nella got expelled, apparently for violating a dress code. So she attended it. So she went back to Denmark and attended the University of Copenhagen there, and grew up speaking Danish and English fluently. But she didn't get a degree in Copenhagen either. So she comes back to the United States and settles in New York City, where she goes to nursing school, and she does get a nursing degree, one of the few black women at the time to get a degree in nursing. And it's during that period that she goes back to Fisk University, or actually she goes to the Tuskegee Institute, and becomes a teacher there for a while, but then decides to go back to New York. And then she meets a man who will completely change her life, an extraordinary guy named Elmer Emmis, who was the second black man in American history to earn a PhD in physics. Elmer Emmis was an important physicist in the 1920s and 30s. He worked on quantum mechanics, infrared spectroscopy, and magnetism. And so he did major work at a time when Jim Crow laws were in effect all over the place. So it's pretty extraordinary. And so marrying him propelled her into the ranks of the upper classes in Harlem. But once again, Nella Larsen was an outsider because she came from a poor family and didn't have a college degree. So she didn't kind of fit in with the upper crust of the Harlem Renaissance period. She made friends, though, with Carl Van Vechten, the white writer and photographer who was a good friend of Langston Hughes and a man who mentored a lot of the Harlem Renaissance writers. And it's during this period that Nella Larsen wrote her 2 novels. Larsen had a very small body of work. She wrote 2 novels and about a dozen short stories, most of them during this time period. Then her marriage falls apart. Her husband turns out was having an affair with a white woman, so they divorce. He gives her a pretty handsome alimony, and she also wins a Guggenheim scholarship, the first black woman in America to win such a scholarship. And so she travels to Paris and lives there for several years, working on another novel, but she becomes depressed and stops writing the novel and actually never writes anything else, never publishes anything else for the rest of her life. When her ex-husband dies in 1941, the alimony stops, so she comes back to New York and moves to Brooklyn and becomes a nursing administrator in a hospital. And she didn't write anything else, and she died in 1964. And at the time of her death, all of her books were out of print, and she was in complete obscurity. But much like Zora Neale Hurston, Larsen's books, particularly this one, Passing, started to gain in stature in the 1980s and 90s. And now her books are some are taught in colleges or on required reading lists. And in 2020, the U.S. Post Office honored Nella Larsen with a postage stamp. So she's one of those writers from the Harlem Renaissance who disappeared for a while, and then their legacy came back in more recent times. All right, so the novel Passing is about two childhood friends, um, Claire, let me make sure I get the names right here, Claire Kendi and Irene Redford. Uh, Claire, they're both mixed race women, very light complected, and they're both able to pass as whites. Claire Kendi, her father dies. He was an alcoholic who beat her. He dies, and then she gets shuffled off to live with two aunts who force her to work as a maid. So to escape that, she marries a wealthy white man who turns out to be an extreme racist. They spend most of their time living in Europe. Irene, on the other hand, stays in the black community. She lives in Harlem. She marries a doctor. She has two kids, and she goes alone to Chicago. And just by chance, she goes to. She's living her life as a black woman, but when her husband's not with her, she sometimes will pass as white to avoid the hassles. And it's a hot day in Chicago. It's a summertime, and there's a roof on the hotel where she's staying, but it's for whites only. So she passes herself off as white and goes up to the roof. And it's there that she runs into Claire. By chance, they're both on the rooftop. And so they reconnect, and Claire tells her about her life. They haven't seen each other in a dozen years, so she tells her about her life living with this white guy in Europe. And so they reconnect, and then the story skips ahead about a year or so. This time in New York, uh, Claire has moved to New York with her businessman husband, and she's missing the connection she had with her childhood friends and with the social life in Harlem. So she starts showing up in in Harlem and hanging out with Irene, and Irene's very worried about this because she's afraid that if they're spotted and if the secret gets out that Claire's part black, that it's going to destroy Claire's life, because her husband is such a deep racist. Um, so but Claire doesn't care. She enjoys the parties and the nightlife in Harlem. So anytime her husband's away on business, she sneaks over into there, and she meets Irene's husband and starts flirting with him. And Irene becomes increasingly worried that the two of them are having an affair. And then the final scene occurs at a party. Well, actually, I skipped ahead a little bit. Irene is walking down the street in New York with a black friend, and Claire's husband sees them, and then he realizes something is up. Why is this white woman, with this black woman? And he starts to realize that they're passing, and he starts to think that maybe his wife is passing too. And so the final scene takes place at a party in a big hotel in Harlem, and Claire's there, and Irene's there, and this black friend of both of them are there, and then Claire's husband shows up, and he confronts her and starts calling her racist names, and she walks over to a window in this upper story building, and then Irene rushes over to her, and then suddenly Claire falls to her death out the window. Now the thing about the novel is it doesn't make it clear. It's ambiguous whether Irene pushed her, killing her, because she's angry that her former friend is having an affair with her husband, or maybe she commits suicide by jumping because she realizes the jig is up. Her husband, Claire's husband, realizes that she's black, and or it may just be that she slipped and fell. So the book ends with Irene in despair about her friend's death. But it's not clear whether she's in despair because she feels guilty for killing her or just because she's upset over what happened. So it's a very dramatic and kind of a melodramatic ending to this fascinating novel. Of course, things have changed a lot since the 1920s. Nobody tries to pass for white anymore, and the kind of restrictions that were around then. There's still prejudice. We all know that, but it's not nearly what it was in the 1920s. I, in fact, have two biracial daughters, and they move in and out of different cultures without any issues at all. They don't consider themselves tragic mulattoes or anything like that. But it's important to realize that the world was a quite different place in the 1920s, even for upper class black people in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. There was this constant threat of danger and violence from white people. So, if you are interested in reading a book by black writers or books by black writers during Black History Month, this is a good one to start with. Nella Larsen's Passing. And if you enjoy this book, you might want to read her other novel, Octopus. She also wrote about a dozen stories. It's really, really tragic that she stopped writing because she was one of the most talented writers of the Harlem Renaissance. But she stopped writing in the early 1930s, and even though she lived to 1964, she didn't write anything else after that. But anyway, it's a good book. It's an important book by an important writer of 1920s America. The book is Passing. The author is Nella Larsen. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.